All right, everybody. This will be the lecture on the history of the internet. In 1969, Leonard Kleinrock enters the scene. So, what makes Leonard Kleinrock famous is he developed a system to make a call between two different computers. So, before 1969, computers were inexistent, but the computer that he used, which he's actually standing next to right now, was the first um, two processors that communicated to each other. And what he did is he and his assistant were, one was at UCLA, one was at Stanford, and Leonard called the computer at Stanford and then transmitted a message. And the message was essentially going to be login, Login. Well, they got through the first three letters, Log, before they lost the call. But it was a success in their mind because they were able to connect both of the computers. And what we would like to look at this today is this is a precursor to what will become uh, internet communication. But let me clarify, this isn't where the World Wide Web started. In 1985, FileNet is designed by IBM, and FileNet is almost a precursor to what content management systems are, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. But what FileNet did is it allowed large amounts of data to be organized in a visual way. Then we get to 1987. In 1987, Robert, I can't pronounce his name, forgive me, Kalu, proposed the first hypertext system while working at CERN. We're going to be coming back and forth to CERN, but for those of you who do not know, CERN is a European um, like I get this right, nuclear scientific lab. It's huge. They have all different types of equipment here. The biggest thing is they have accelerators that allow them to accelerate uh, biomaterial and actually create things like um, fusion and work with atoms and work with biological materials at the micro level. However, um, they're known for a lot of scientific breakthroughs beyond this, um, uh, beyond the physics that they do here. And I'm not going to spend too much time on CERN, um, but I do want to clarify that a lot of the internet's key players came out of CERN. So this is in 1987. Robert enters the scene, and he proposes the first hypertext language or system, excuse me. Then we get to 1989, 2 years later. What's significant about 1989? Well, Taylor Swift enters the scene, but unfortunately, she does not contribute anything to the World Wide Web except traffic. But we do have Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Now, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, he is also at CERN, and he proposes an information management system which will become the World Wide Web. So when we talk from here on out and we talk about where did the World Wide Web come from, we're talking about Sir Tim Berners-Lee working at CERN, taking Robert's hypertext language and developing the World Wide Web. In fact, CERN has even here recently posted information, about it being the World Wide Web. I like that they're doing this because, I mean, obviously you can come to CERN and you can see that they're doing a lot more than just, web traffic today. The biggest thing, of course, is their accelerators. This one's here, which go on for miles and miles and miles. but it is the birthplace of the World Wide Web. So then what Berners-Lee and Robert do is they collaborate together and they develop a system called Inquire. And what Inquire is it takes the language that Robert has developed and that Berners-Lee has um, produced and allows us to actually browse what the hypertext is. This essentially, the screenshot is what we're talking about. Like, this is what the web was in 1990. You didn't have a browser. You had to use specific software like Inquire to communicate through HTML to see what you were doing. It's its basic form. Essentially, here's a screenshot of kind of what hypertext looks like, but essentially what we're talking about is this. This is HTML in its simplest form. I'm not saying that this is what the HTML that Berners-Lee and Robert used, but it's a good example of what basic HTML looks like. And then when we render this in a browser, this is what it looks like. So this is a good example of just simple basic HTML. However, we're viewing this in a browser. When this was developed, they had to use Inquire to interpret this information. And you had to have a computer that had this information. Both you and the server computer had to have the software or you couldn't communicate. So that's 1990. In 1993, Mosaic is formed. So Mosaic is our first internet browser. By this time, the public has access to the internet. And if you have access to Mosaic, then you can take it a step further and you have access to an actual browser that will render the HTML and you start to have control over design for the first time ever. We will call this Web 1.0. We have a browser, we have a coding language, and we're using both of those to interpret the content and the design. Although I'm not going to go too far and say this design is amazing, but it's a screenshot of what the first browser would look like. So after 1993, just a year later, Hyken William develops cascading style sheets. Where's he working at? He's working at CERN. He's also working under Berners-Lee and Robert. So his whole thought was, we have this HTML, but what can we do with the HTML from a design and functionality standpoint? And so he develops cascading style sheets, also known as CSS. An example of CSS would be here. So this is CSS, cascading style sheets. We call them cascading style sheets because they cascade throughout the page. For example, I'm defining a style sheet to the body of our page. I want everything in my body to be centered. And so what this does is, there we go. It will now center everything in my structure because I have told it to. So it's cascading throughout the document, and I only have to define it once. Before cascading style sheets came on the scene, you would have to style each element individually and do what we call inline styling, or actually HTML styling, because you would actually use the HTML structure itself or the attributes themselves to change font, size, and very basic structure elements. We will talk a lot about cascading style sheets, and we'll get into a lot of it in the next lectures. But the important thing you need to know is that CSS stands for cascading style sheets. I will never refer to it as cascading style sheets. I will always say CSS. We also have the World Wide Web Consortium. form in 1994. This is huge because not only does it come out of CERN as well, but the World Wide Web Consortium, it's concrete. It still exists today, and it still is a think tank of where the web is moving. It's branched out a whole lot more between the laboratory at CERN, and we have large key players involved in the World Wide Web Consortium, like Google, Microsoft, WordPress. But the goal of the World Wide Web Consortium at the beginning and still today is we want to make sure that the web is useful, that everyone can access the web, and that there's a future for the web. So it's huge. Like, this is in 1994, and we still have it today, thankfully, because now it's gotten to be more political as far as who accesses the web, who controls the web. And so, because of the World Wide Web Consortium and because of key players like Microsoft, Google, WordPress, and others, they're standing up for students, households, and just everyone who uses the web so that they can have access to not just to the web, but be able to manipulate, use, and access the web. Probably repeat myself there. Then we get to 1996. So in 1996, I mentioned FileNet earlier as kind of a precursor to content management systems. Well, in 1996, we have our first one. It's called Story Builder. It's a content management system, also known as a CMS, that is used or designed to allow website builders a little ease in structure and design. And then we have Microsoft Internet Explorer 3 be the first browser to incorporate CSS. For those of you who do not know, Internet Explorer is the precursor to what is now Microsoft Edge. On the right, that is a screenshot of Microsoft Internet Explorer 3 using some style sheets as well as a alert box. So at this point, style sheets are still very basic. CSS is very basic, but we have a browser that can interpret it. Surprisingly enough, it's Microsoft. Then we go to 1997. In 1997, that's the year I graduated high school. It's also the year that two relatively big things happen with the web. Microsoft introduces iframes. Iframes will allow you to bring in content from other websites and embed them into your site. So I have an example here of what an iframe is doing. So here's, again, another basic structure. I have a couple of H1 and H2 tags up here, and then I've created a simple table. And tables, in its basic form, tables are used to structure something. So I have a table, I have a table row, and I have a table column. Then I have two iframes, and in these iframes, I'm actually calling two different websites, YouTube and Wikipedia. And when we render these, this is what it looks like. So I'm actually pulling content from YouTube here, and I'm pulling content from Wikipedia on the right. There's two significant things that are happening here. One, for the first time, HTML has the ability to pull in content from other locations, whether it be a file on the existing server or another website. But it also creates some havoc. Early forms of HTML and iframes were cluttered. You didn't have a whole lot of control of what happened. Once this iframe is in your site, you can't control what's behind here. This is actually on another website. This is on another website, and everything else is on your website. So it poses a design issue because you can't make this look seamless or part of your design. And it's also a functionality issue. iframes in their basic form are very, very rigid, and you didn't have full control of, say, scrolling or width and height. And we also had browser issues when you embedded them. For example, some browsers would interpret them different than other browsers, and it created a lot of conflict. And that stuck around for a while to the point where it's still around today. However, we still use iframes today, and browsers have been updated so that they can interpret iframes cleaner, including the ability to add CSS to iframes, which is something we couldn't always do. We also, in 1997, have the DOM. The document object model is introduced, which allows us to develop a tree-like structure to build documents and apply control and styling to each element. On the right is a flowchart that shows you how the document object model works, also known as the DOM. At the top, we have our document. That's our entire saved file. Then we have what's called HTML, which defines the structure of the document. And then within the HTML, we define a head tag, a title tag, and some text. We also have the ability to do a body. Within the body, we have an H1, a paragraph, another paragraph, some text, some attributes. So let me kind of explain what's going on here. This is an example of how the DOM is structured. And this is a key reason why I will emphasize that you need to indent your code, because it allows us to see the DOM and understand what's going on. So at the beginning, we have HTML. We're defining the structure of our document. Then we have two sections. We have a head and we have a body. Within the head, we're defining the CSS of the document or the entire DOM. In the body, we're defining the structure as well as the content of the DOM. And each of these elements represent elements of the DOM. They're all objects that are a part of the DOM, including your text. And we'll go into more of this later as we build our first few HTML pages and then our website. But the basic understanding is the document object model is every object within your document to define the structure, the content, and the overall document. So then we get to 1999. In 1999, a web designer, see what I did just there? I called her a web designer. She's no longer a programmer. She's a designer. Darcy DiNucci, which ironically, I don't think she works at CERN. So she coins the phrase Web 2.0. This is the first time that we actually have a structure, or sorry, a title added to the web, not title, version added to the web. So she coins this Web 2.0 because we have a browser, we have CSS, and we have access to all three. And more importantly, we can now use those to design and build wonderful content and HTML websites. Web 1.0 is defined in and around this time because it wasn't until here that we actually have a new version of the web. Then we fast forward to 2003. In 2003, WordPress enters the scene. WordPress is not the first CMS, and it's not the only CMS in 2003. What it is it's a turning point for actually an existing blog system. So in 2003, we have this this blogging software called B2 Catalog. This is it right here. Funny enough, the archives don't work anymore. But if you look, the last entry is in March 2004, the following year after WordPress comes out. And you can still download this. If you ever wanted to play with it, if you want to geek out, you can go and grab it. Uh, Interestingly, they do call it WordPress because it's no longer B2 anymore because they inherited it. But let me get to the story. So in 2003, these two guys, Matt Mullenweg and Mike Little, they're actively participating in this B2 catalog blogging tool. There's a third guy who actually developed it, and I won't go into detail about him other than the fact that he came up and he just put a blast out on the blog system and said, "Hey, I don't want to do this thing anymore. Does anybody want to take it over?" And so Matt Mullenweg and Mike Little stand up and they say, "Yeah, we'll take it. We'll take it on." So they take ownership of this blogging tool called B2 Catalog. They make some updates, they do some improvements, and then the following year in 2004, they relaunch it under the WordPress name. So I say 2003 because that's when they actually take it over. But then if you look at the versions of WordPress, um, the actual release of WordPress comes out in 2004, but Mike and Matt are actually a part of it in 2003 in the B2 catalog form. You don't need to know much about B2 catalog. You just know that that's the precursor to WordPress. Like WordPress came out of that. Um, and if you go through the history of WordPress, you'll see that the earlier versions are B2 catalog. So in 2003 and 2004, Mike and Matt develop and relaunch WordPress. Then we get to 2007. 2007, we have our first iPhone. There it is on the right. Now it's in January 2007, released in June of that year. My boss got the first iPhone. He was the coolest guy on the block. 3.5-inch diagonal screen, 320 by 480 pixels. So it wasn't even HD, was it? I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not smart in that. Was that? Is that? That's not. No, 480. So yeah. Um, Price $499, 8 GB. Um, but they had another version too. I think that you get more than 8 GB on there. Um, I don't. I mean, other than the price, like the iPhone has changed a lot. Um, I do think that it's interesting that we're starting to see the iPhone go back more towards the style. People like the smaller version. They like the smaller screen on the iPhone. Um, but this is 2007, and then in 2008, a year later, we get the Android smartphone, which comes out, the wonderful HTC Dream. You see that there on the right. It's actually a slide down because it's Android. It's got the keyboard still. Has anyone seen Android's proposal to bring this back? There was a model last year, or supposed to come out this year. It may even be out. I just commercially haven't seen it anywhere. But they have tried to bring back the keyboard a lot, the slide out keyboard on different models throughout the years. Um, and there's talk that there's one that was supposed to be pretty solid and come out this year, but I haven't seen anything about it. So it's 2008. Then in 2010, we have the first iPad, but more importantly, we have the term responsive design coined by Ethan Marcotti. Uh, the whole goal of this is to describe the fluid layout design for internet viewing on all devices. That is true to today. So this comes out in 2010. Here we are 10 years later, And we still have developers and designers and even web shops that aren't using responsive design within their structure. I'll get into this more, but responsive web design means that you want your web to work seamlessly in any device, and you do not want to hinder any of your content. You do not want to restrict any of your content because of the device. We're still struggling with this today. I looked at a website just yesterday on the phone, and it did not respond at all. And I was like, that's really weird. Like it was just a desktop version. You had to, you know, zoom in to see the structure and everything like that. So a it's still a struggle, but thankfully the majority of the web is and the people behind the web have moved towards responsive design and responsive layouts and mobile first thought. So we have 2016. I'm going to give you a second. What happens in 2016? In 2007, the iPhone comes out. 2008, the first Android. 2010, the first iPad. In 2016, mobile internet traffic surpasses desktop traffic. We are now 4 years into mobile first traffic. Last year, Google came out and said we will present everything in a mobile first framework. All our data comes mobile first, all of our information comes mobile first, all of our research and development is mobile first. This means that we look at the web outside of a desktop or a laptop. It's mobile, it's on phones, it's on tablets, it's on your washer, it's on your refrigerator, it's on your TV. The concept that Roberts and Berners-Lee had in the beginning, where we had just basic HTML structure, we're beyond that at this point, and we're talking how is that structure going to be used, and more importantly, how is that content going to be interpreted. So from here on out, when we talk about web design, we're actually talking about that content and how do we present that content to users. And we'll get to more of that in the next lectures, but this is a good starting point because you see where the web came from and where the web is today. And there will be a quiz associated with this, so stay tuned to Canvas, and I'll post that information. And if you have questions about the slides, or if I introduce some confusion and you see that on the quiz or whatever, reach out to me because I want to make sure you remember this information and aren't tripped up by it. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, that's the end of this lecture.